So good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Mitch Berkowitz. I'm the Associate Rabbi at B'nai Israel in Rockville. Nice to see some of our Rockville community leaders, some of our members from B'nai Israel, and so many others. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm honored to be hosting this first session with Dr. Michal Raucher. So I'll do our introductions. Like I said before, if anybody has questions, just write to me in the chat. But Dr. Michal Raucher is a JTS Fellow and Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. Her research lies at the intersection of Israel studies, Jewish ethics, and anthropology of women in Judaism. She's also published on sexuality and gender in Judaism, religion and bioethics, and abortion legislation in Israel. It's an honor to learn with you tonight. And so you're going to go ahead and begin, and I will put in the chat the link to the resources if anybody wants to access it that way.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Berkowitz. Should I share my screen? There was a previous email where I said I should share my screen.
You can,
okay,
if you should be able to, yeah.
Okay, I will, just because I don't know who has the sources and whatnot. So it's wonderful to be here with everybody. I've been in person at this event, I don't know, maybe once or twice. And it's so invigorating. I did it when I was coming from New York, and the trip, we make the trip down early in the morning and then we teach all day. And I end up just being excited on the way back because the conversations are so, I don't know, inspirational and exciting. It's a great teaching experience. So I'm glad that we're doing this over Zoom. And I, before I share my screen, I want to kind of, and I'll invite anybody, feel free to turn on your screen, even if you're eating dinner or, if you're comfortable. Any faces are better than no faces if you're able to. So I do a lot of teaching about Jewish reproductive ethics. I've been researching reproductive practices and policies among Jews for many years. I have a book that just came out on reproduction among ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and I'm doing some new research on abortion among Jews in America. So, my background is in Jewish ethics. So I do a lot of Jewish reproductive ethics. And the vast majority of Jewish ethical attention in the reproductive arena is on the ethics of getting people pregnant. So, the ethics of reproductive technologies, or, engaging with this pronatalism argument, which means, encouraging Jews to reproduce. So that's kind of one piece of Jewish ethics on reproduction, getting Jews specifically pregnant. And the other piece of Jewish ethical literature on reproduction is about helping Jews not be pregnant. So the ethics of contraception and the ethics of abortion. And so I'm usually teaching on one of those two topics, and they're undoubtedly important areas. But I have been thinking recently about whether Jewish reproductive ethics can speak to some broader concerns. Broader means both more expansive in content and more expansive in terms of the population. So, does Jewish reproductive ethics present us with an ethical formula for thinking about people who are not Jewish, perhaps, right? Does it present us with just a different way of viewing reproduction that we can somehow bring into the public square? So tonight, I want to think about two questions. The first is, can or does Jewish reproductive ethics map onto or reflect the reproductive justice movement in its goals and areas of advocacy? And I'm going to talk about what reproductive justice is in a second. So if you don't know what it is at all, I will give you my very brief intro. So that's kind of the first thing. Is there Jewish reproductive ethics that isn't just about getting people pregnant and not getting people pregnant, specifically getting Jews pregnant and keeping Jews from getting pregnant? And the second is, can or does Jewish reproductive ethics speak to our obligations as Jews to the wider community, right? Reproductive justice is about expanding reproductive access and health and rights to everybody, not just those with money, not just those who are legally protected to it, not just those who are seen as, the subjects of the law. If we have within Jewish ethics, this is kind of the question that's ruminating in my mind as I think about these sources. If we have within Jewish ethics permissibility for abortion, for instance, should we be advocating for greater access to abortion? I say yes, but I'm going to see if I can convince you of that. Does Jewish ethical reasoning compel us to advocacy and increasing access for others? That's kind of the large question that's undergirding that piece, okay? So I think these questions are important in part because I'm motivated by the reproductive justice movement. I consider myself an advocate and an ally of that movement. Their ideas and their work resonates with me, and I want to see it flourish. I also know Jewish reproductive ethics, and I think there are points of intersection here. But I haven't seen Jewish reproductive advocacy moving in that direction. So some of you might be familiar, every few months even there's kind of, an article in the Jewish press, like that goes something like this. Judaism is in favor, or Judaism is pro-choice in some way. But that's kind of where it stops. And I want to see it go further. I want to see it move away from the rights language and towards the justice language. And again, I'm going to say what that is. Okay. So, or even, I look at data on Jewish perspectives on abortion. Jews are overwhelmingly supportive of the legalization of abortion. It's something like between 70 and 80% of Jews surveyed in the last couple of years think that abortion should be legal and paid for by, the state in all or most cases. And yet, Jewish reproductive advocacy is kind of stuck in a legal framework, and I want to see it go further. So it makes me think that Jews would be supportive of the reproductive justice movement, but I don't think many people know about it, and maybe they don't know that Jewish ethics aligns with it. So that's what we're going to talk about. And by the way, this isn't meant to be self-congratulatory, like, yay, Jewish ethics, we support reproductive justice. Instead, I want us to see that for Jews, reproductive justice is our issue too. It resonates with what we think about abortion. And we should be more outspoken, with what we think about reproduction. And we should be more outspoken about that. So with that, I will turn to the sources. Okay, there we go. Okay, do you see this now? Yes, good. Thank you, Rabbi Berkowitz. I appreciate that. Okay, so the principles of reproductive justice. Now, if you're a student of reproductive justice, you might be familiar with some other principles, and they have changed over the past 20 years. But these are the principles as taught to me by one of the founders of the movement. So I'm going with these, but there are kind of a few different permutations. So reproductive justice was established. It was a movement that combines reproductive rights and social justice. It was officially launched by a group of Black women in the 1990s in response to multiple forms of reproductive oppression and injustice against women of color. The idea was that the reproductive rights language and the reproductive health language was not sufficiently addressing the needs of women of color and other minority communities. So when we think about reproductive language, right, there's reproductive health, which is about individual service delivery, social services. It emphasizes reproductive health services that women need. Like one of the problems that reproductive health could address is unintended pregnancy due to a lack of access to birth control or a lack of education about effective birth control use. Reproductive rights is kind of the second pillar of the reproductive advocacy framework, and they're doing, legal advocacy So one thing you might hear in the reproductive rights world is an example, like if they're addressing a university, a religious university that says they're exempt from covering birth control in their employee and student healthcare plans, that's an issue for your reproductive rights advocates. But then there's reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a movement that is built using human rights standards and the intersection of health, rights, and justice. It's about uplifting Black women's experiences and options and choices. So reproductive justice holds that reproductive oppression is a result of the intersections of multiple oppressions. So, for instance, one example is that Medicaid does not cover fertility treatments like in vitro fertilization. And if you are on Medicaid, the message then is that you are not encouraged to have children, and it is not made possible to you if you are infertile in some way or need some help getting pregnant. So that's really the intersection of both the legal arena, the justice arena, the health arena, all of these things intersecting in reproductive justice. So the principles of reproductive justice, as taught to me by one of the founders of the movement, is that every individual has the human right to, one, decide to have children, which means they have the human right to birth support, pre and postnatal care, access to reproductive technologies. That's number one. Number two, every individual has a human right to not have children, which means they need methods of contraception, receive contraceptives free of force or coercion. They need to be connected to pregnancy prevention, to the prevention of sexually transmitted infections, and they need access to surgical and medical abortions. And three, the third one that we're going to be addressing tonight, is that every individual has a human right to parent the children they already have to thrive. The idea being is that they're trying to avoid a reproductive loss, like the death of a child is considered a reproductive loss. That is an access for that is an issue for reproductive justice. So how do we guarantee that they can parent the children they already have to thrive? In this safe and healthy environment means they have to have access to social and economic supports. They have to live free of environmental toxins. Think about the Flint water crisis or police violence. And they have to live free from violence in their communities and state-based violence. And there are a whole number of other things that are involved in there. But there is a fourth sort of principle of reproductive justice that was added more recently. That's the right to sexual pleasure and enjoyment without procreation. We're not going to address that tonight, not because I don't think that's contained within Jewish reproductive ethics, but merely because I don't think we're going to have time to address it. But that is a fourth one. So those are the principles of reproductive justice. And what we're going to look at tonight is whether sources within Jewish thought can sort of support each of those principles. And I think they can. So we'll jump right in with number one. So part one, the right to have children. Every individual has the right to have children. So what I brought here is a source that's probably very familiar to all of you. From the first chapter of Breshit, of Genesis, we get what is largely considered by many people to be the first mitzvah, the first commandment that Jews receive, right? And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, Pru urvu, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth. So this source, and I could bring, 10 more textual sources to support this, and 100 more examples of ways in which the Jewish community bases its pronatalist ideas, the idea that Jews are encouraged to have children on this first commandment here of Pru urvu. This becomes the basis for all of the support for reproductive technologies, all of the, you might be familiar with all of the sort of demographic counting of Jews that goes on both in America and in Israel. It is largely understood that reproduction is mitzvah, and our rabbis go into great detail to describe exactly how that mitzvah needs to be fulfilled with the number of children and the gender of children, and it's all based on this source here as the root for that mitzvah. So I could bring this source alone, and that could be it. That could be kind of, example one of how Jewish reproductive ethics and thought support this principle of reproductive justice. But I wanted to move it into, so I brought kind of here in this first part, our kind of oldest source and one that is extremely recent. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put a date on the second source here. But this second source, which I'm going to just scroll up for a second, was written by Dr. Michal Biton in a very recently in an article she published, I think it was in 2021, so maybe a month or two ago, called "Is Jewish Continuity Sexist?" The kind of background to this article is that this pronatalism discourse has been critiqued from a few different angles for it putting in value on women only to the extent that they can reproduce. In other words, when reproduction is encouraged to the extent that it is in the Jewish community, it ends up making women feel, and many women report this, that they are not contributing to the Jewish community unless they are reproducing. It makes them feel like if they don't want to reproduce, they are kind of stigmatized from the community. If they can't get pregnant, it is considered a great shame because of all of these other expectations of women to have children. In addition to the fact that the pronatalist discourse in America has largely been dominated, at least in the last 20 years, by Stephen Cohen, who has admitted to the allegations of sexual assault that came against him. And so the pronatalism discourse has been the discourse itself has been stigmatized now. And Michal Biton is asking, is there any way of preserving this discourse? This is what she really wants to do in this piece, in this article. She wants to say, is there a way that we can say, okay, yes, Judaism is pronatalist and that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that women have no other value. And so she writes this, she makes a case for why pronatalism plays such a strong role in the Jewish community. She says, our tradition is unequivocal in treasuring the ability of parents to pass their legacy forward. Even a not so lachrymose conception of Jewish history is replete with examples of attempts to destroy Jewish continuity. The pharaohs and Hamans and Queen Isabellas and Hitlers have ensured that Jewish survival, biological continuity endowed with spiritual meaning and covenantal commitment, became a sacred act of Jewish resistance, what Emil Fackenheim called the 614th commandment. The very personal act of pregnancy and childbirth has taken on intense collective significance as a mitzvah for the sake of God and the Jewish people. The value of children and biological reproduction seemed clear to me from a purely logical and purpose-driven perspective too. If we believe that we are working hard to build a good society, wouldn't we want to perpetuate it? This approach need not depend on chauvinism that upholds the exclusive goodness of one's own people. It just means that if we desire a communal reproduction, we should acknowledge that historically it has been most easily achieved through biological reproduction. So she's saying here that the idea of Jewish continuity, right? Reproduction is necessary because the idea of Jewish continuity is held so high. Reproduction is a sacred act of Jewish resistance. It's a mitzvah, not just in the legal obligatory sense, but in the communal sense. And it's one of the only ways, or at least one of the most direct ways of ensuring continuity. And that's what she's getting at. In other words, it's not just about fulfilling this mitzvah of pru'urvu. Reproduction for Jews is about ensuring continuity against all odds. It's taking all of the haters and all of the anti-Semitism and saying, you know what, we're going to keep going, right? There's going to always be hatred and people trying to exterminate the Jews, and the Jews are going to keep going, and they're going to do that through reproduction. So on these sources alone, right, we can say that even despite the problems with pronatalism, and there are many with problems with pronatalism as an ideology, as a legal practice, and it's seen extensively in Israel, which I'm happy to discuss. It is definitely, it has created a culture where if you want to reproduce, you can. And in that way, and you can and you should, and the community will support you in that. And I'll just add a little asterisk there, and we can talk about that asterisk afterwards, but the community will support you in that. So in terms of principle number one of reproductive justice, right? Every individual has the right to have a child if they want to, pronatalism has that covered. Okay, Jewish pronatalism has that covered, great. Okay, let's do part number two, the right not to have children. So here I've brought in a couple of sources. Let me just ask, Rabbi Berkowitz, what time should I end for questions? 7:30? What do you think?
I think we want to switch at 37, so just before 30 is good, yeah.
Okay, super. Okay, so I'll aim for 7:27, super. Okay, so the right not to have children. So what I brought here is a couple of sources, and also I tried to kind of mix up the centuries here, so we'd get a sense of the fact that these are ideas that are percolating for a long time within Jewish thought. So the first is from the Mishnah, right, codified between the 3rd and 5th centuries. And this is a discussion about really abortion, and it reads like this. It's a little traumatizing. It can be traumatizing though, so I just want to kind of warn you. If a woman is having difficulty giving birth, the child must be cut in her womb and brought out limb by limb, for her life takes great precedence over its life. If the greater part of the child has already come forth, he must not be touched, because one life must not be taken to save another. So here we see a few things. One, that the rabbinic, the rabbis seem to have a clear understanding that pregnancy can endanger a woman's life, that pregnancy can be a life-threatening act, that birth can be a life-threatening act. And so that's kind of piece number one that needs to be identified really clearly here. The second is that until birth, really until that fetus or baby, whenever you believe that transition occurs, starts coming out, an abortion can be performed. Now, I think what's important about this text, and not kind of using it too literally now, is that what we would call this today is a quote unquote partial birth abortion. And I don't want to emphasize it too much, because these almost never happen. The vast majority of abortions happen in the first trimester of the pregnancy. And so it's not kind of good practice to think that the Mishnah is giving us like a good model for thinking about this, but just in terms of a kind of way in which they think about life and priorities, and the real danger that pregnancy and birth can pose to a woman, is something that is part of the reproductive justice language too, right? That recognizing a woman's bodily autonomy is embedded in the reproductive justice framework, and deciding not to have a child is recognizing her bodily autonomy here. The second source is from Rabbi Uziel in the 20th century, early in the 20th century. Now many rabbis from the 17th to the 19th century, so much later, more recent rabbis, are debating what reasons would be sufficient to permit an abortion. Some allow them in the case of adultery, and some don't. Some allow them in the case of a possible disfigurement for a fetus, others don't. So this is a kind of very rich conversation that's going on across several centuries. And I like what Rabbi Uziel says here, because also it kind of goes back to this idea of bodily autonomy. He says, it's clear that abortion is not permitted without reason. That would be destructive and frustrative of the possibility of life. But for a reason, even if it's a slim reason, Tom Kaluch, such as to prevent her nivul, her embarrassment, then we have precedent and authority to permit it. So they're talking about, would it be possible to permit an abortion if she has an affair and gets pregnant for it? And how much that would embarrass her in terms of, her relationships and her whole social circle. And so, that's a really kind of, I think that's really radical. I don't think you would hear many people say these kinds of things today, but it is an acknowledgement that a woman's pain is not just physical, but that emotional pain is also embedded in reproductive choices and reproductive life histories. And so that I think is really important to pull out. I might skip, I'm going to kind of just very briefly do this Israeli abortion law. Now, this is in the 1970s, Israel was debating how to legalize abortion. That was on the table. And ultimately, what they came to is that abortion is illegal, except in these 4 circumstances: a mother's age. At the time, it was under 20 and over 40. Now it's under 33 and over 40. So if you are under 33 and you want an abortion in Israel, you go to your doctor and you say, I want an abortion, and she'll say wonderful, they'll say wonderful, and you'll even get it paid for by the National Health Plan. Abortion is also possible if the pregnancy resulted from rape or incest or adultery, if the continuation of the pregnancy carries the possibility of harm to her health or life, which is understood extremely broadly. Think also about Rabbi Uziel's very broad understanding of a threat to her health. And if the baby might be born with physical or mental disabilities, also conceived of very broadly, which admittedly has its own critique, right? We can address this from a disability rights standpoint and talk about it in a different way. And I'm happy to have that conversation from the perspective of women's bodily autonomy and the right to decide not to have a child. Israeli abortion law isn't perfect. There are any number of ways that it's problematic, but in some ways it provides us with a model for thinking about how we could uphold reproductive justice and still be supportive of Jewish precedent, basically. Okay. And the last, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is a wonderful, more recent, this is from 2012. Sarah Tuttle Singer wrote a little piece for Kveller called My Jewish Abortion. And she talks about the shame she felt going in as a quote unquote nice Jewish girl and asking for an abortion from her healthcare provider. And one of the problems was she couldn't pay for the abortion. The abortion was going to cost her $250 and she didn't have the money. And the abortion provider notices that she's Jewish because she's wearing this little Magen David on her on a necklace, and says, well, actually, there's a philanthropic Jewish women's group that will pay for your abortion. And all you have to do is be Jewish and want to end your pregnancy, and they'll pay for it. So just as another kind of, this is a real life example of a Jewish group saying, you have the right and we will pay for it for you not to be pregnant right now. It reduces some of the stigma, and it lets her think, it helps her to think that maybe it's not so unusual for her to be Jewish and want to end a pregnancy. So that goes a long way. Okay. I hope you're holding your questions, and we'll get a chance to discuss them. I'm on my last source right here. Okay. Okay, my last source is, and this is about the right to parent the children we have. This is a little bit long. Now, this one is written by Dr. Mara Benjamin, who published a wonderful book in 2018 called The Obligated Self, in which she aims to expand Jewish philosophical and ethical thinking about obligation. She focuses on the idea of obligation and explores what can be learned about obligation by looking at the maternal or the parental child relationships. So in paragraphs A and B, she's expanding a kind of Jewish conception of obligation here. And she talks about how that sense of obligation has been expanded in recent years. So she says, in many streams of rabbinic thought, a Jew can never abrogate her status as a Jew and her obligations to God and Torah. Like parenthood, being a Jew is a status that, once established, can be dissolved only under extreme circumstances, or extreme conditions, if at all. For born Jews, the covenant to which they are party precedes any single individual's lifespan or voluntary assent. In other words, Jews start out, in some sense, always already obligated to the covenant. Its obligations can only be transgressed, not voided. So what she's saying there is this sense of obligation precedes you as a Jew before you even consent to it. You are obligated to follow the laws. You don't get to choose not to. That obligation is, well, you can choose not to, but you're still obligated, right? You're transgressing that obligation if you don't, but that obligation still exists. In an intellectual and political environment hostile to traditional Jewish life, Jewish religious philosophers started changing this idea. They landed on an ingenious strategy for retraining but transforming the significance of obligation. The cost of this approach, however, was a fully realized concept of the individual to whom the self is obligated. In other words, in paragraph A, that sense of obligation was to something more abstract, to God, to laws, to the thing of Judaism. Later on, in more recent centuries, Jewish philosophers started saying you are obligated to a particular other person, or to an other, even more broadly, a community, an individual, but it could be somebody you know, somebody you don't know, but you're obligated to someone. Most influential Jewish thinkers conceived of the intersubjective encounter of two people, and therefore of the individuals who participate in it in decidedly abstract terms. The other they envisioned has no specific social location or set of needs. It's difficult on the basis of these thinkers' writings to imagine how such meetings occur in the course of ordinary life and how durations of relationship, social proximity, and differences of power might affect them. So what she's saying is they changed the sense of obligation to that you are obligated to someone, but they never specified who that someone was. And therefore, the obligations you would have would differ, and the way you would interact with that person would differ. The obligations I have to my parents are different than the obligations I have to my children, in other words. But Jewish philosophers never distinguished between those two things. They just said, you're obligated, and that was it. Mayor Benjamin says, if we take the example of kids, right, your obligations to your kids, things get a lot more specific. And so this is what I think she really adds to this conversation. These shifts in my relationship, because, sorry, I'll back up. She's talking about when she first had a baby at home and how much her life changed as a result of having a newborn at home. So she says, these shifts in my relationship to time, the material world, and my own autonomy comprise the beginning of being an obligated self, a self radically bound up with someone else. In my child, I recognized the one person with whom I felt I could not walk away. In rational moments, I recognize this to be untrue. Parents of small children can and do free themselves from the obligations of daily care or other substantive involvement by de facto relinquishing the claim to parenthood. I knew that, yet I found it unthinkable that I would refuse the role into which my new child had, by the very fact of her existence, suddenly put me. She exerted a gravitational pull, and my role was now to orbit her. To be an obligated self was to be subject to the law of another, the law of the baby. The law could not be fulfilled in abstract, but only in active, embodied, material actions like soothing, feeding, cleaning, comforting, distracting, smiling, and wiping. It became the law of the crying toddler who sought out not just any, but specifically our or my comfort. The law of her seeking out our or my face for approval and interest. And the law of the baby was not just the law of any baby, but the law of this baby. This baby had to be woken up throughout the night because she was born small. This baby responded with great interest to one particular toy. Plus, that should be plush toy. This baby's imperative was to hold her at a certain angle so she would fall asleep for a nap. The next day, the next week, this baby no longer responded to that position or that toy. Now, I think what happens here is that Mara Benjamin presents us with an idea of obligation, of being bound to somebody else specifically, and that those obligations are physical, emotional, and material for basic human care, feeding, clothing, cleaning, comforting. Obligations are also specific and temporal. People need different things at different times in their life. Children need different things. So Benjamin reads these obligations as part of Jewish philosophy, as part of Jewish reproductive ethics, as an extension of where Jewish philosophers left off. And I think that Benjamin's addition here really reflects this third principle of reproductive justice, that people have the right to raise their children to thrive in healthy and safe environments, that actually this is an obligation of Jewish ethics, of Jewish reproductive ethics, to provide those basic material, physical needs to other people. Okay, I'm going to stop in a moment. The last thing I'll just sort of alert you to on the source sheet is an example from the National Council of Jewish Women that has just revamped their reproductive advocacy toolkit. And they talk pretty extensively about reproductive justice. For the most part, I find that their toolkit is surrounds abortion rights and advocacy, but they are leaning towards Jewish reproductive justice. And as I think one of the most outspoken Jewish organizations today talking about reproductive anything, I like leaving their example here too. So they leave their, this is in their abortion and Jewish values toolkit, which has been sent around to hundreds of rabbis across the United States. And you'll see they also outline the 4 principles of reproductive justice. So, and there, Rabbi Berkowitz, I hope you've gotten some questions. I'm going to stop share. Great. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. For those who are here, if you can please insert your questions into the chat. That's how we're going to facilitate Q&A this evening. So please go ahead and insert a few questions in the chat. I guess I'll start off with a question. In the beginning, you referred to the fact that the movement for reproductive rights began with women of color. Can you speculate a little bit about why that was, and why was it not, as some other things that we've seen in the world maybe come from either a diverse community of women or from white women? So can you say a little bit more about why you think that may have been the case?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just correct. I may have said it incorrectly at the beginning, so I'll make sure everybody hears it. So the movement for reproductive rights was largely, and it sort of spearheaded, I guess, in the 60s and 70s, was largely spearheaded by white women. And although women of color were included, there's a lot of racial tensions in the feminist movement at the time that meant that women of color's experiences and advocacy was not lifted up the way that white women could have lifted up their experiences and voices. The movement for reproductive justice was largely started by women of color in the 1990s, largely because the movement for reproductive rights was ignoring the experiences of Black women in particular, but other minority women as well. And that's largely because the movement for reproductive rights was about, legal protections, and, making contraception legal and abortion legal and all the regulations around abortion, making sure that states couldn't outlaw abortion, after Roe and all of these things. And one of the big refrains from the activists in the reproductive justice movement was, okay, these legal protections exist, but we don't have any access to them, right? There aren't enough abortion clinics in our neighborhoods, or they're still too expensive, or we have to take off 3 days of work in order to travel to get an abortion. That's not actual choice, right? So that's kind of piece number one. But the other one was that, right, so it was, let's change the language from rights to access, right? How do we ensure that people have access and availability of all of these things? But the other piece was that, especially principle one, the right to have children, came out of a racist history of forced sterilization of women of color. And so Black women were saying, wait a second, we actually want to have children. We don't want this movement just to be about how to prevent pregnancy or how to terminate a pregnancy. We actually want support in all of its ways for, in other words, legal, financial, medical, for getting pregnant and for having children and raising them in safe ways. And this is something that white women largely took for granted because they were encouraged to have children, whereas Black women for a very long time were not, and were and so that's kind of some important shifts that the reproductive justice movement was introducing into the discourse.
Thank you.
Yeah,
for,
great question. Thanks for letting me clarify that.
Expanding on that, of course. A question here about maybe commenting a bit on the environmental impact of population growth, and whether or not there's a Jewish ethic related to that.
Yeah, I that's a great question. This is a tricky one for me, because there have been a few Jewish ethicists, very prominent ones, who, right, argue against population growth and you're forcing me to not be apologetic, which is very good, who argue against reproduction because of environmental reasons. The problem is that they speak out of both sides of their mouth largely, because if that's, maybe that's not the right idiom, but I think it is. In other words, they say one thing about Jews should be encouraged to reproduce and have more children, but in other parts of the world, people should not be. And if you push them on this, what they're really saying is people of color in other parts of the world should not be having as many children. And so that's a really troubling and racist statement about reproduction, frankly. So I didn't bring any of those sources. And if I was going to have, if we were going to really present all of the kind of pitfalls of the Jewish reproductive language, that would be one of them. Another one, which I hope that's a sufficient answer to whoever asked that question. Another kind of pitfall that we could talk about, actually, the Israeli abortion law is largely discussed. Maybe many of you had this kind of reflection upon reading it, as, wow, that's so liberal, right? Abortion is permitted and paid for in all of these circumstances. That's amazing. And yes, in some ways it is. And the Israeli abortion law requires a woman to get approval for her abortion. She has to actually apply to a committee, and the committee has to review her request and make sure it conforms to one of the stipulations of the law. Now, on the one hand, somewhere between 97 and 99% of those requests are approved every year. And those on the committee largely talk about it as a rubber stamp. On the other hand, that is kind of explicitly against the principle of bodily autonomy. In other words, a woman doesn't actually have the right to make that decision on her own. She's she's forced to get a committee approval for it. So, I'll just say about all those things, I think Jewish reproductive ethics brings us so far, it doesn't bring us all the way. There are definitely ways in which I think the Jewish reproductive ethics conversation could be improved in order to be really good allies of reproductive justice.
Thanks. there was a question asked regarding, I think that you actually may have just answered to a degree about, this is all in the context of Jews having children or not having children and reproductive rights for the Jewish community. But what does reproductive justice look like for the rest of the world and non-Jews? And you referred to some of the problems and pitfalls with that. So hopefully that also answered that question. A question here with respect to reproductive rights and perhaps rooted in rabbinic literature or in other places that you might be aware of about how that applies during the third trimester of pregnancy. There are a questioner asked that they said that their recollection is that there are some sources that say when the fetus can live outside of the body, abortion is not permitted. And they understand the access argument, but they want to sort of think more about what this says and how does the rest of the movement respond to this question?
Yeah. So I'll say again before I answer that those abortions are extremely rare. We're talking like maybe 5% of all abortions in the United States are occurring in the third trimester. It's like half of 1% are occurring in these, maybe it's even smaller, in these kind of, last week kind of things. So it's a very small percentage. There is a famous debate, I'll answer it this way. In the 1970s, maybe this person who asked the question is familiar with this debate, between Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg in Israel and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in America, where they're both debating the abortion of a fetus with Tay-Sex. And Eliezer Waldenberg in Israel says if it's not discovered until the 7th month, even if it's not discovered until the 7th month, that an abortion is permitted at that time because of the emotional pain that a woman would undergo and her family would undergo as a result of giving birth to a baby with Tay-Sex that would ultimately live a very short and painful life. And Moshe Feinstein in America says, this is ridiculous. Basically, this is ridiculous. Eliezer Waldenberg doesn't know anything, which, by the way, Eliezer Waldenberg was a huge Torah scholar. I mean, so to say he doesn't know anything is like kind of a ridiculous insult, but he doesn't know anything. He's reading the texts all wrong. And by the way, we Jews in America can't possibly go around saying that abortion is permitted until the 7th month. Because what's going on in America, who is holding those positions in America, right? The Christian right is largely dominating the anti-abortion movement in America. And so what kind of image would that present of the Jews if it got out that Jewish rabbis were permitting abortion even in the 7th month? So, and that is really guiding his reading of the rabbinic sources then. So, and I bring that example just to say that there are rabbinic opinions that will say abortion is not permitted until, after 40 days, which is about 6 weeks. There are rabbinic positions that will support abortion until the very end of pregnancy, like the Mishnah that we read. And a lot of it depends, and even today, you'll find that kind of variation in rabbinic positions across the movements. And it largely depends on what else is going on contextually and what other issues are being brought into the conversation. So it's kind of an answer, non-answer. I hope that person's satisfied. But I see that Janice Singer has a hand raised. I don't know if. Oh,
I think we got Janice's question, but.
Oh, okay, super.
Did we? Yes. Oh, not yet. You're okay. Okay, thanks. We're almost at time, but I guess just a short practical question. Can you tell us about the makeup of the committee in Israel what's the gender balance and are women represented on that committee?
Yes. So, and another question you might be asking is about our rabbis on that committee, and that answer is no, there are no rabbis on the committee. So there is a general practitioner, a doctor, and an obstetrician, and a social worker that's on the standard committee. At least one of them must be a woman on the committee. Usually the at least is the social worker, but often the obstetrician or the general practitioner is also a woman. So it could be 2 out of 3. If there are any Shtisel fans in the audience here, the almost is mildly accurate. So in case you're curious. And then there's a high risk committee. And those committees, by the way, the regular 3-person committees are at every single hospital in Israel. And then there's a high risk committee that evaluates abortion, pregnancy termination requests after 24 weeks. And those are made up of 5 people, which includes a pediatrician, and also the head of a unit in the hospital. So yeah, and those are only at some hospitals in Israel. Great question.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Raucher. We're unfortunately out of time for